What are you doing?
Working.
Working at what?
Working out an article to help people understand the basic overall structure of a story by using Freytags Pyramid.
What's this pyramid thing then?
Well, it's a triangle, a sort of broken triangle with the base turned inside out and words put all over it so that it makes sort of sense.
So not actually a pyramid?
No, not at all really.
And who's Freytag?
He was some German novelist who tried to overcomplicate narrative structure and more or less failed. But in modern times, his ideas of the five-element story structure have been refined so that they make sort of sense.
So it's not a pyramid and Freytag wasn't responsible for it?
Pretty much, yes.
This is most of the reason why I don't like humans. You are the rest of the reason. This is a way of looking at a story and breaking it down into the component parts. There are many ways to do this, but the wildly inaccurate, and laughably terrible, Freytags Pyramid, is probably the most popular. German playwright and novelist, Gustav Freytag wrote a study of the five-act structure of stories which suggests that all stories have five key parts. Much of what he said has been lost to translation, and the modern interpretation of his ideas have been beaten with a blunt instrument and forced to make sense.
Makes sense?
As a tool to analyze a story, the current version of the concept does nicely hold up as a way of both looking into the structure of a narrative, as well as offering a handy tool for the initial basic plotting of your own story. According to Freytag, a story breaks down into five key parts. We'll ignore what he originally said since the translation of the German to English has introduced a few wobbles, as well as a subtle shift in the uses of certain words, so we'll just stick to the less confusing and more accurate modern iteration of the concept.
I think it's for the best.
Sometimes, and bafflingly, called the exposition, the introduction introduces the reader to the world the book is set in. In this section of the story, there will be a main character who we will meet and get to know. We will discover the world they live in, get an idea of where the story is set and what the situations are in play, that will later drive the plot. According to Freytag, this section of the story will end with the inciting incident. This is an event that will cause our main character to go on the journey that will define the rest of the narrative.
I'm gonna be a famous writer someday.
Often, the inciting incident isn't mentioned since it varies so significantly in stories that it isn't always consistent enough to nail down. As an example, in the 1977 original Star Wars, the moment that begins the plot is when the main character, Luke, discovers his family murdered. Or it may be when the princess is captured. Or it could be the opening shots where their ship is under fire. Or perhaps it happened before the film began when the rebels captured the villain's evil plans. For this reason, the inciting incident is treated with suspicion. It's a useful thing for a writer, plotting out their story, to know that, very often, something will happen that will force the main character to do something that will create the narrative journey, but as an observer of the story, it's much harder to decide what it might be. In any case, the introduction must give the audience all they need to know to understand what's happening in the fictional world about them. In the very same Star Wars, this is done with a sprawl of words splattered all over the screen, which serve as a fantastic example of what happens when a film is made by someone who doesn't know how to write.
You shut your damn mouth!
Number 2. Rising action. Rising action is everything that happens up to the climax.
I've nothing else to say.
Number 3. The climax is the moment of highest tension. The climax of a story is what everything leads to. It's the moment where all the plot points come together to make a final reveal, where the hero is tested to their limits, where a terrible choice has to be made, where the fate of the world hangs in the balance.
Did I climax? Sure.
The climax is the part of the story where all is finally revealed. It's the moment we've all been waiting for. It is for that reason that stories have to be carefully and properly thought out. You can't create a successful, tense and satisfying conclusion if your story doesn't know where it's going. It takes skill to carry our characters from the origins in the introduction of the story to the final moments where they face the final outcomes of their trials. A lack of understanding of how to craft a good climax is why many stories fail to engage with their readers. To go back to the original Star Wars, the climax is where the main character, Luke, switches off his computer and fires his torpedoes, saving the day. At that moment, the fate of the galaxy hangs in the balance. Will his friends live or die? Will the hero's cause be wiped out? Will the galaxy fall to the power of the villain's deadly superweapon? It's the whole point of the story. It takes everything we've witnessed to far and takes us to the end of a journey where the odds have never been higher. This is why the rising action leads to the climax and needs proper planning. In Star Wars, if you simply took a boy living on a farm somewhere in space and then put him in a fighting spaceship with no targeting computer, the story would simply make no sense whatsoever, much like all of the modern Star Wars movies. We need the rising action to establish who the characters are, what odds are they facing, who is the main character, what special abilities does he have that make him the person he was always meant to be. A well-planned rising action brings answers to all those questions so that when we arrive at the climax, the odds have a sense of importance to us. Number 4. Falling action. After the climax, we have falling action. This is the series of events that happen, taking us down to the final moment of the story, the resolution.
That's all there is to it.
That's all there is to it.
Number 5. The resolution. The resolution is the end of the story. It's where we close the book, switch off the screen and begin to walk away. This moment shows us the emotional consequences of the story. It shows how our characters have been changed by the experience. It is the moment in westerns where the cowboys ride off into the sunset. The falling action will follow the events that lead us to the end, the moment where the writer chooses to end the story. At the end of the story, we should know our characters well enough to be able to imagine what will happen next. We know them as well as we know any of the real people in our lives, and they can continue to exist in our imaginations.
And they all lived happily ever after. The end.
The diagram of Freytags Pyramid generally shows an incomplete and equal triangle, because humans apparently don't know what a pyramid is. The usual depiction of the structure shows the introduction being a straight line with the rising action heading off upwards towards the climax. But in reality, the structure would look more like this. The introduction can be as long as it needs to be. It could occupy a large portion of the story, so long as in doing so, it remained entertaining to read. The climax, by its nature, is going to be very close to the end of the story, since everything is designed to lead up to that moment. The resolution of a story is generally a single chapter, or even a single scene. It's a much shorter part of the story than any of the others, and the action that leads to it is also generally swift. The reason for this is that the action has led us to the climax. Now, the tension has been released and the audience is losing interest. A good author should know when to stop.
Yeah, that's all fine. Close enough.
But what would all that look like in a story? I can't picture it very clearly since my imagination processor is made from 2 old hard drives, 7 RAM cards and a regulator motor from a broken fridge.
This was the only chance he was ever going to get. There was nowhere left to run, and he knew that they had him surrounded. Worse, they were beginning to close in. William peered around, his chest heaving heavily as he fought to control the waves of fear that threatened to engulf him. The Egyptian soldiers were everywhere, guns in their hands, and they made it clear that they were not afraid to use them. The vault was dark and gloomy, even with the artificial light from the electric flood lamps that were dotted around the cavern, connected to the outside world with bunches of long, snaking wires. The air inside was damp, despite the heat from the mid-afternoon sun beating onto the ground high up above the cave they were now in. He knew he had no choice now, so he made a dash for the pyramid, his heart pounding as he ran the short distance, and he grasped as he finally made it to the base. He got there just as the first shots rang out. The sound of gunfire echoed around the place. He dug his hands into a crack between gigantic carved rocks, and he began to climb. He had discovered it several years prior, almost by accident, and it had taken him this long to get into the secret chamber. But he had found it, this great hidden structure. He had found a previously undiscovered pyramid in an underground cave of all places. It was a pyramid made from dusty yellow sandstone and granite, unseen by human eyes for countless centuries. "Dr. Freytag," Sergeant Farouk's voice cried out angrily. "Come down now, nobody wants to hurt you." William swallowed hard and dragged the full weight of his body up the steep, smooth surface. "Why do you have guns then? Why have you been firing at me?" he shouted back. "We must leave this chamber, Dr. Freytag." The voice shouting at him sounded furious. "We will kill you if you leave us no other choice. This is no place for us to be. It must be allowed to keep its secrets." He could hear them shuffling towards the base across the sandy floor. With no weapon of his own, the soldiers were free to pick him off whenever they chose. The chamber was sealed except for the small door he had carved through the rock to get in, and there was no other way out. He was trapped now and out of options. Despite this, he couldn't leave without finding out what was at the top. Too many years had led to this moment for him to consider giving up now. "Freytag," the leader of the men called out. Several more shots rang out from below. They never struck the pyramid, they were clearly warning shots. He was more determined to climb now than ever before. "Come down, Freytag," the voice cried out in rage. "You have no right to be in here." "I have every right," he shouted back breathlessly, scrambling up to the top with all of his strength. "I found this pyramid. I found it by decoding the ancient texts. This cave, this pyramid was left for us to find. They want us to discover what is at the top. The fact that I found it proves that humankind is ready to know." "Humankind has no right," an angry shout answered him. Freytag dug his hand into a crevice and he pulled himself up towards the top. He was nearly there now. His muscles were weary and heavy, but he was almost at the peak. "Freytag," the voice barked at him, and a single shot rang out. A cloud of dusty rock flicked up from the granite block he was hanging from. That was close. "You must stop, Freytag," the voice demanded, but nothing could stop him now. He shouted back, "There is a great secret at the top of this pyramid. We both know it. It is the technology of the ancients," he shouted back with impotent rage. "It is not to be known by man." "I disagree," he called out with the last of his breath. His hand reached for the top as the soldiers below him took careful aim. This was it. Everything had led to this moment. "This cave is solid, no way in, no way out. How was this thing built? How did they use it? The secret to all of that is kept at the top of this very pyramid." "It is too dangerous. Go no further, Freytag," the officer warned. Around him, 5 soldiers took aim with their service rifles. He said darkly, "You leave me no choice." Freytag saw it, a glowing green stone embedded at the tip of the structure. He reached for it as the sound of gunfire filled the air. As his hand grabbed the stone, shots whipped past, the jagged stuttering of automatic weapons spewing bullets in his direction. His hand closed around the stone, and it lit up brightly. Then he was suddenly falling, tumbling helplessly back down. For a moment he panicked, not knowing what was happening. It was too dark to make out the shapes, and he was falling fast towards the solid floor beneath him. The gunshots now sounded like they were a long way off, and were echoing away into the darkness. He sat up suddenly. He was in his room. His computer on by his side. Light from the sweltering afternoon sun illuminated the peeling white plaster walls of the Egyptian hotel room. His chest was pounding, and his clothes were wet through with sweat. Had it all been a dream? He ran his right hand over his chest, looking for bullet wounds. Nothing seemed to make sense, and he glanced around in confusion. It had to have been a dream. He looked down to his left hand, where a small green crystal was glowing brightly. He began to smile to himself as suddenly he began to realize just exactly how the ancients had managed to build the pyramid in a cave without an entrance.